They had measured the docking cradle for a shuttle. That is the detail I keep returning to after all these years, the smallest, pettiest detail of the whole affair, and somehow the one that tells you everything. The High Concord had assigned humanity a docking cradle sized for a diplomatic shuttle, a small one, the kind a minor petitioner species sends when it comes to beg, and they had done it on purpose, and they had laughed about it. And I know they laughed about it because I was the one who filed the assignment, and I heard them laugh. I was there for all of it. I am the reason you are hearing the true version and not the official one. And the true version begins with a docking cradle measured for a shuttle, and ends with the most powerful warship in the galaxy filling the sky over our station. And in between is the story of how an entire civilization learned, in a single afternoon, that it had badly misjudged the quiet people from the small blue world. Let me tell you who I am so you know why my account is worth your time. My name is Ossun Vae, and I am Liorn, a small, careful, ceremonial people, keepers of protocol, the species the High Concord had long employed to manage the endless, intricate etiquette of galactic diplomacy. We were good at it. We had been doing it for a very long time. The Liorn understood precedence and seating, and the 1,000 tiny gradations of honor and insult that govern how proud civilizations speak to one another without going to war. And I, Ossun Vae, was a senior protocol officer at the Concord station of Havenreach, which is where this happened, and I had spent 40 years arranging the careful theater of galactic power. I knew where every species sat at the great table and why. I knew which insults were deadly and which were merely cutting. I knew, better than almost anyone alive, the precise machinery by which the strong humiliated the weak in the galaxy, lawfully, ceremonially, with perfect manners. And I had operated that machinery, I will confess, without ever once questioning it for my entire career. I want to tell you what it does to a person, to be a keeper of protocol for the powerful, because it is part of how I came to do the thing I am ashamed of. Protocol is a beautiful art. I mean that. The Liorn take real joy in it, the elegance of a perfectly arranged ceremony, the satisfaction of an insult delivered so precisely that the insulted party cannot even object without seeming crude, the deep craft of choreographing power so that it never has to show itself as mere force. We told ourselves we were civilization itself, the thing that kept the galaxy from war, the careful oil in the machinery of the great powers. And there is truth in that. But there is also a poison in it, and the poison is this. When your whole art is the management of how power behaves, you stop asking whether the power should be doing what it is doing at all. You become a craftsman of the thing, and a craftsman does not question the commission. I had arranged the ceremonies by which a dozen weak peoples were lawfully stripped of their worlds, and I had taken professional pride in arranging them well, in the smoothness of the theater, in the perfect manners with which the crushing was done. And I had never, in 40 years, let myself look past the choreography to the people being choreographed out of existence. That is what protocol had made of me. A being who could arrange a funeral for a civilization, and feel only the quiet satisfaction of a ceremony well run. I want you to understand the station, because the station is where the whole thing played out, and the place mattered. Havenreach was the Concord's great diplomatic seat, not a war world, not a fortress, a place of ceremony, a vast and beautiful station hung in neutral space where the civilizations of the High Concord met to make their compacts and admit their members and arrange the affairs of a galaxy. Picture great halls of pale stone and living light, gardens grown from 100 worlds, the air carefully balanced so that a dozen species could breathe it at once, and everywhere the soft, constant murmur of diplomacy in 40 languages. Havenreach was designed to be impressive, designed, in its every line, to make a visiting petitioner feel small, to communicate without a word the immensity and antiquity and power of the Concord they had come to join. I had spent 40 years making sure it did exactly that. The smallness of the visitor was the point. The Concord admitted new members the way a great house admits a poor relation, graciously, condescendingly, with every courtesy and no respect. Every part of Havenreach was a message, and I knew how to read all of them because I had written most of them. The grand approach, down which a petitioner species was made to walk for nearly a kilometer beneath the banners of the great powers, each banner older and vaster than the petitioner's entire recorded history. That was a message. The hall of admission itself, with its tiered seating that placed the old powers high and near the center and the petitioners low, and at the edge, the geometry of the room itself a diagram of who mattered. That was a message. Even the light was a message. The petitioner stood always in a slightly colder, dimmer light than the assembled members, a thing so subtle that no visitor ever consciously noticed it, and every visitor felt it, the bone-deep sense of being lesser, of having come as a supplicant to one's betters. I had designed that lighting scheme myself, years before. I had been proud of it. It was, I had thought, my finest work, the art of making a whole civilization feel small without a single word that could be objected to. That was the genius of Havenreach, and I was one of its principal authors, and I tell you this so you understand that when humanity came, it came into a machine purpose-built across centuries to diminish it, and that I was the engineer who kept that machine running. And the day this happened, the visitor we were admitting was humanity. I should explain what humanity was to us before that day, because the contempt is the whole foundation of the story. Humans were new. They were minor. They had come up out of their single small world only a few generations before, spread to a handful of colonies, and presented themselves to the galaxy as a young species seeking its place, and the galaxy had regarded them the way it regarded all young minor species, which is to say barely at all. They had no great fleet that anyone had seen. They had no powerful patrons. They held a scattering of unremarkable worlds in an unfashionable corner of space, and they had asked, politely, to be admitted to the High Concord as a full member, with all the rights and protections that membership conferred, and the Concord had agreed to consider the petition, and had scheduled the admission ceremony, and had assigned them a docking cradle measured for a shuttle. But there was a thing beneath the ceremony, and I knew about it because protocol officers know everything, and it is the thing that turns this from a story about manners into a story about justice. The admission was a trap. The bloc that dominated the High Concord in those years, a coalition of the old powers, led by a vast ancient civilization called the Cephal Dominion, did not actually intend to admit humanity as a full member. They intended to use the ceremony to humiliate them, and the humiliation had a purpose, and the purpose was a world called Tessen. Tessen was a small world on the edge of human space, inhabited not by humans but by a minor species called the Well, a gentle agricultural people, and Tessen sat on something the Cephal Dominion wanted, a resource, the usual thing, the thing these stories always turn on. The Well could not protect themselves, but humanity had some years before made a protection compact with the Well, had promised to stand for them, to shield Tessen, a young species extending its hand to a smaller one. And the Cephal Dominion's whole scheme rested on this. If humanity were admitted to the Concord only as a minor member, a junior member, a member without the full standing to enforce its compacts, then humanity's protection of Tessen would be worthless, legally, ceremonially worthless, and the Dominion could take Tessen lawfully, with humanity unable to stop them. I should tell you about the Well, because I had read the files and most beings in that station had not, and the files are the reason I could not entirely silence the thing in me that had gone quiet for 40 years. The Well were farmers. That is nearly the whole of what there was to say about them. They had been farmers on Tessen for as long as they had records, a slow, contented people who shaped their lives around the seasons of a small green world and asked nothing of the galaxy except to be left to their fields. They had no fleet. They had no weapons to speak of. The thing the Dominion wanted lay deep under Tessen's soil, something the Well had never even used, had barely known was there, a buried wealth that meant nothing to them and everything to an empire. And when the Dominion's survey ships had first come, years before, and the Well had understood dimly that their world was wanted, They had done the only thing a weaponless farming people can do. They had looked for someone to stand with them. And of all the powers of the galaxy, only one had answered, the young humans, themselves still small, themselves still finding their place, who had heard a gentle people ask for protection and had given it freely, with a compact and a promise, asking nothing in return but the right to call the well friends. I had that promise in my files. I had read it. It was a generous and foolish and beautiful thing for a young species to do, to make itself the shield of a people who could give it nothing. And the Cephal Dominion had read that same promise and seen in it only a legal obstacle to be ceremonially dissolved. The admission ceremony was the mechanism. Admit the humans small, deny them full standing, and the door to Tessen opened. The well would lose their world. Not in fire, the Dominion did not work in fire, but in the slow, lawful way, the survey teams and the relocation orders and the careful documentation. A gentle farming people administered off the land their ancestors had tended, filed under resolved, while the humans who had promised to protect them stood by with no legal standing to lift a hand. And it would all be made possible by a shuttle, by the size of a ship in a docking cradle. And the proof that humanity could be admitted small, the ceremonial demonstration of their insignificance that would justify the junior membership, was to be the shuttle. The Concord had, through careful diplomatic channels, communicated to humanity the expectation that they would send a single modest diplomatic shuttle to the ceremony, as befit a minor petitioner species, and the size of that shuttle, sitting in its small cradle in the great docking bays of Havenreach, would be the visible, undeniable, ceremonial proof that humanity was a small people who knew their small place. The Cephal Dominion had engineered the whole thing. They had even, I learned, leaked the expectation widely, so that the galaxy's representatives would gather to watch the small human shuttle arrive and understand, without a word being spoken, the lesson. Humanity is minor, humanity is junior, humanity cannot protect what it has promised to protect, and Tessen is the Dominion's for the taking. I arranged it all. That is my shame, and I tell it to you plainly. I assigned the small cradle. I drafted the ceremony of junior admission. I knew what it was for. I knew about Tessen. I knew the well were going to lose their world. I knew humanity was being set up to be humiliated and stripped of the standing to keep its promise. And I did my job, the careful, beautiful theater of it, because that was what I had always done, because the strong humiliated the weak with perfect manners, and I was the keeper of the manners, and it had never once occurred to me that I might refuse. 40 years. I had arranged 100 such humiliations. The well and their small green world were just one more item on a long ledger of the lawfully crushed, and I filed the shuttle assignment, and I did not lose any sleep, because I had stopped, long ago, being able to see the people at the bottom of the machinery I operated. The Cephal delegation was already aboard when the day came, smug and certain, and I attended them, because attending the powerful was my function. The Dominion's chief envoy was a creature named HFY Vae, ancient and cold and unfailingly courteous, the kind of being who could order a world emptied and thank you for your service in the same breath. HFY Vae was pleased that morning, pleased in the restrained way of the very powerful, and as I escorted the delegation to the great admission hall, HFY Vae paused at the wide viewport that looked out over the docking bays and the stars beyond, and looked at the small, empty cradle waiting for the human shuttle, and said to the assembled delegation, in a voice I have never forgotten, "Observe the cradle. By the measure of what arrives to fill it, a civilization announces itself. The humans will send a shuttle, and the galaxy will see exactly what they are, and Tessen will fall into our hands by their own small hand. It is elegant, is it not? We will take a world and never raise a weapon, and the humans will hand it to us by the very smallness of their arrival." And the delegation murmured its appreciation, and I murmured mine, because that was my function, and I looked at the small, empty cradle and felt nothing at all. The human ship was detected at the edge of the system 4 hours before the ceremony. I was at my station in the docking control center when the contact came in, and the first reports were routine. A single vessel, inbound on the human approach vector, exactly as expected. The shuttle, right on schedule. I noted it and prepared to log its arrival, the small punctual shuttle of the small punctual minor species, and I thought no more of it. And then the sensor officers began to go quiet. I have learned across a long life that the most frightening sound in any room is not a scream. It is the sound of skilled people going silent, the sound of experts who have just seen something their expertise cannot account for and have stopped speaking because they do not yet have words for it. That is the sound that filled the docking control center of Havenreach 4 hours before the admission of humanity, as the inbound contact grew clearer on the sensors and the sensor officers, one by one, stopped talking. I looked up from my logs. I went to the central display, and I saw what they were seeing, and I did not have words for it either. It was not a shuttle. The thing inbound on the human approach vector was a ship, but the word ship sat on it the way the word stone sits on a mountain, technically correct and wildly inadequate. The scale of it was wrong. The sensors kept recomputing the mass because the first readings could not be right, and then the second readings confirmed the first, and then the third confirmed the second, and the number that settled onto the central display of Havenreach's docking control was a number that did not belong to any vessel in the Concord's registry, a number that exceeded the Cephal Dominion's own flagships, that exceeded anything any of us had ever tracked. A single inbound mass so vast and so dense with power that the station's own sensors strained to encompass it, and it was not only large. As it grew clearer, the sensor officers began, in hushed, appalled voices, to read off its other qualities, the power signatures, the weapon emplacements, the defensive systems, and every reading was worse than the last. Every reading described not a diplomatic vessel but a warship, and not merely a warship but a warship beyond anything the galaxy had a category for. A thing built at a scale, and to a standard that made the proud fleets of the High Concord look like the small punctual shuttles we had expected humanity to send. I remember the exact moment the senior sensor officer, a careful old Thren who had held that post for 30 years and had never once been wrong about a contact, turned from her station and looked at me, and her voice, when she spoke, was the flat, careful voice of someone reporting a thing they cannot believe they are reporting. She said, "Officer V, I have rechecked the readings 4 times. The vessel inbound on the human vector is not a member of any class in our registry. By mass and power output it exceeds the Dominion flagship Eternal Adjudication by a factor I am not comfortable stating aloud in an unsecured room." She paused. "Its weapon systems are in a powered-down state. Deliberately, it is broadcasting no threat. It is simply coming at ceremonial approach speed." As if it were a shuttle. She let that sit, and then she said the thing that frightened me more than any of the numbers. "Officer V, it is announcing itself as the human diplomatic vessel for today's admission ceremony. The most powerful warship any of us has ever seen is presenting itself formally as a diplomat. I do not know what that means. I have no protocol for it." I had no protocol for it either, and I am a keeper of protocol. Having no protocol is, for a Liorn, a kind of vertigo, the ground itself dropping away. Because the senior sensor officer had put her careful old finger on exactly the thing that made this not a simple display of force. A warship that came firing was a thing the galaxy understood, terrible but legible. A warship that came with its weapons deliberately cold, at ceremonial speed, announcing itself politely as a diplomat, was a thing no power in the Concord had a category for because it was a contradiction, overwhelming force presented as courtesy. The humans were not threatening us. That was the horror of it, the thing that emptied the room of its certainty. They were keeping the appointment. They had been told to send a diplomatic vessel to the admission ceremony, and they had sent one, and it happened to be the most powerful warship in the galaxy, and they were flying it to the ceremony at the exact courteous, unhurried speed of a shuttle. And the message in that, the message I would not fully decode until the envoy spoke that afternoon, was not "we will destroy you." The message was something far more unanswerable. It was, "You wanted to discuss the terms of our smallness. Let us discuss them, as equals." Earth had not sent a shuttle. Earth had sent the most powerful warship in the galaxy, and it was 4 hours out, and it was coming, slow and steady and utterly unhurried, straight for the station where the powers of the conquered had gathered to humiliate the small blue world and take a gentle people's home. I want to tell you about the silence in that control center, because it was the first of many silences that day, and each one taught me something. It was the silence of a great many beings who had, in the space of a few minutes, watched the entire foundation of their certainty dissolve. We had all of us, every species in that station, built our understanding of humanity on a single assumption, that they were small. That assumption had a docking cradle measured for it. And now something was coming up the human approach vector that could not be reconciled with smallness in any way at all, and the not being reconcilable was rewriting, in real time, every calculation in every proud head aboard Havenreach, including, I would soon see, the calculations of Hasvale and the Cephal Dominion, who had engineered a humiliation that depended entirely on humanity being exactly what humanity had just announced, in the most unmistakable way possible, that it was not. I did the thing protocol officers do. I went to inform the delegations. And as I made my way to the great admission hall, through the beautiful pale halls of Havenreach, past the gardens of 100 worlds, I found that my careful Liorn composure, the composure of 40 years, had deserted me, and that my hands were trembling, and that under the trembling was a thing I had not felt in so long I barely recognized it. It was not fear, though there was fear in it. It was something closer to hope, and it appalled me, because I did not understand yet why the arrival of a warship of impossible power should make a careful old protocol officer feel anything like hope. I understood by the end of the day. I understood when the human envoy finally spoke, and I understood what the warship was actually for, which was not at all what any of us in our terror assumed. But that is the end. Let me tell you about the 4 hours and the arrival, and the moment Hasvale of the Cephal Dominion looked out the viewport at the thing filling the sky over Havenreach, and understood that the trap he had built had just closed on him instead. Let me tell you how the galaxy learned what it had misjudged, and then let me tell you the far more important thing humanity did once it had everyone's attention, the thing that turned a story about a warship into a story about what power is actually for. I was in the great hall of admission when the warship arrived, and I watched the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy discover, all at once, that the ground had moved beneath them. I have arranged 1,000 ceremonies in that hall. I have never seen it the way it was that afternoon. Let me set it for you. The hall of admission was full, every great power of the High Concord seated in its tiers, the old civilizations high and central, the lesser members ranged below and out toward the edges, and at the very front in the place of honor, the Cephal Dominion, Hasvale at its head, cold and patient and certain. The hall had been prepared for a humiliation. The ceremony of junior admission was drafted and ready. The small dim light was set for the human petitioners who would arrive. The documents of restricted membership lay waiting on the great table, and the whole vast room hummed with the comfortable anticipation of the powerful about to watch the weak put in their place. I had set every piece of it. It was, I thought, ready. And then the station itself betrayed the ceremony, because you cannot hide a thing that large. The warship did not dock. It could not have docked. No cradle in Havenreach could have held it, certainly not the small one measured for a shuttle, and the joke of that small, empty cradle had curdled into something no one was laughing at any more. The warship took up a station off the great viewport of the hall of admission itself, deliberately so that it filled the view, so that the assembled powers of the conquered, seated to watch humanity arrive small, instead looked up from their tears and saw, through the vast window that backed the speaker's floor, the most powerful vessel any of them had ever beheld hanging in the black, unhurried, silent, its weapons cold, blotting out the stars. It had positioned itself as a backdrop, as scenery. The humans had made the impossible warship into the set dressing of their own admission, and the message of that placement was so audacious and so precise that even I, who had spent 40 years reading such messages, needed a moment to take its breath away. They were saying, "You prepared a room to make us feel small. Look what we brought to stand behind us while you try." The hall did not go silent in the way you might imagine. It went silent in waves. First the lesser members at the edges who saw the thing through the viewport and stopped their murmuring, then the middle tiers, and last, slowest, most terrible, the great powers at the center and the front, the Cephal Dominion itself, as the reality climbed up through the room toward the seats of those who had been most certain. I watched it reach HFY. I was close enough to see the Dominion envoy's face, and I will tell you exactly what I saw, because it is one of the most instructive things I have ever witnessed. HFY did not look afraid at first. The very powerful have spent their whole lives being certain, and certainty does not break in an instant. It breaks in stages. First HFY looked annoyed, the annoyance of a being whose careful plan has hit an unexpected snag, the assumption that this was a complication to be managed. Then, as the censor reports reached the Dominion delegation and the true scale of the thing became undeniable, the annoyance gave way to a kind of rigid stillness, the stillness of a creature recalculating very fast. And then, this was the moment, the one I have never forgotten. Then HFY understood fully what had happened, and I watched a being of immense ancient power realize that the trap it had spent months building had just closed not on the humans, but on itself. Because the genius of the Dominion scheme had also been its fragility, and HFY was clever enough to see the fragility the instant the warship appeared. The whole plan depended on humanity being small. Every piece of it, the junior membership, the dissolution of the Tessen Compact, the lawful seizure of the Wells world, rested on the ceremonial demonstration that humanity was a minor power that knew its place. And humanity had just demonstrated, in the most unanswerable way imaginable, in front of the entire assembled Concord, that it was nothing of the kind. The shuttle had been the proof of smallness. The warship was the proof of the opposite, and it could not be unseen, and it could not be argued with, and every great power in that hall was now looking at it through the viewport and revising, in real time, its entire estimation of the humans, which meant that the junior admission HFY had prepared was now impossible, absurd, a thing that would make the Dominion itself look foolish for having proposed it. You cannot admit as a trembling junior the power that just parked the galaxy's mightiest warship outside your window. The room would not stand for it. The other great powers, who had been content to watch the Dominion humiliate a minor species, would not lift a finger to help the Dominion humiliate a major one, not when doing so might turn that warship's attention toward them. HFY's coalition was already, silently, dissolving. In the space of the minutes it took the reality to climb the tiers. And the worst of it for HFY was that the humans had not threatened anyone. That was the trap within the trap. If the warship had come firing or even came making demands, the Dominion could have rallied the Concord against it. Aggression unites the powerful, gives them a reason to close ranks. But the humans had done nothing aggressive at all. They had simply kept the appointment with their weapons cold, presenting their impossible ship as a diplomat. They had given the Concord no aggression to unite against, and so the Concord did the thing frightened powers always do when there is no common enemy to rally them. Each great power began, privately, to calculate its own advantage, and not one of those calculations favored helping the Cephal Dominion proceed with a scheme that now looked both doomed and dangerous. HFY sat at the front of a hall full of allies who were, one by one, in perfect silence, ceasing to be allies. I watched it happen. It was the most complete reversal of fortune I have ever seen, and not one shot had been fired, and not one word had yet been spoken by the humans, and it had all been accomplished by the size of a ship in a window. Then the human envoy came. We had all expected, a delegation grand and martial to match the ship, a conqueror's entourage. What came down the grand approach, into the hall of admission, beneath the banners of the great powers, in the cold, dim petitioner's light I myself had designed, was a single person, one human. Unarmed, unescorted, in plain dark clothing with no insignia of rank that any of us could read, walking alone the long kilometer that had been built to make a civilization feel small, and she walked it without hurry, and without any sign of being diminished by it at all, because, and this was the thing, the ship in the window had already made the cold, dim petitioner's light into a joke. You cannot make a person feel small with mood lighting when the most powerful warship in the galaxy is hanging behind them. My finest work, the lighting scheme, the subtle architecture of diminishment, it was useless, neutralized, and I stood at the edge of the hall and watched the human walk through my masterpiece of humiliation as if it were not there, because she had brought, hanging in the black behind her, an argument that no architecture could answer. She reached the speaker's floor. She stood in the place where, by my careful design, petitioners stood to receive the judgment of their betters. And the human envoy, her name, I would learn, was Sarah Ape, an ambassador, not a soldier, which mattered enormously and which I will come back to, looked up at the assembled tiers of the High Concord, at the great powers and the Cephal Dominion at their head, and she did not gloat, and she did not threaten, and she did not so much as glance back at the warship in the window. She simply began to speak in a calm, clear voice that carried to every tier, and the first thing she said reordered the entire room. She said, "Thank you for receiving us. I know you expected a shuttle. I want to be honest with you about why you didn't get one, because I think honesty is going to serve all of us better than ceremony today." She paused and let the hall settle. "You scheduled this admission to make a point. You meant to admit my people as a junior member, a member without the standing to keep its promises, so that our compact to protect the world of Tessen and its people, the well, would become legally worthless, and the Cephal Dominion could take that world without anyone able to stop them. You meant the size of our shuttle to prove we were too small to matter. I know all of this. We've known it for some time." She let that sit, and I watched the Dominion delegation go very still, because she had said the unsayable thing out loud in open ceremony before the whole Concord. She had named the trap, plainly, stripped of all its careful diplomatic clothing, and a thing named so plainly in that room could no longer be done in the comfortable dark. "So we had a choice," she continued. "We could send the shuttle and lose Tessen and let the well be taken off their land while we stood by unable to lift a hand. Or we could send something that made it impossible for you to pretend we were small. We chose the ship, not to threaten you. Look, its weapons are cold, and they're going to stay cold. We chose the ship for one reason only, so that we could have this conversation as equals instead of as a supplicant being processed. Because the thing we actually came here to say can only be said between equals, and you weren't going to let us be equals, so we had to bring something that made the choice for you." And then Ambassador Sarah Ape said the thing that I have carried for the rest of my life, the thing that turned the whole afternoon from a story about a warship into a story about something else entirely. She looked at HFY, at the cold ancient envoy of the Dominion whose trap had just collapsed, and her voice did not harden. It softened, if anything, and that softening was more powerful than any threat. She said, "I could use this. I want you to understand that I know exactly what I'm holding right now. The ship in that window means that today in this hall I am the most powerful person in the galaxy, and every one of you knows it, and I could make this admission go any way I wanted. I could take Tessen for ourselves. I could demand a seat above the Dominion. I could make every power in this room that planned to profit from the well losing their home pay for it. The ship gives me all of that." She paused. "I'm not going to do any of it. And I need you to understand why, because the why is the only thing I actually came here to teach you." The hall was silent. 40 languages, 100 worlds, the assembled power of the galaxy, and not a sound. And I, Ossun Vae, keeper of protocol, arranger of humiliations, stood at the edge of the room I had built to make her small, and I found that I was holding my breath along with all the rest, because I understood, suddenly, that I was about to hear the thing my whole 40 years had never once let me ask. What is power actually for? She told us, but that is the last part of the story, and it deserves to be told whole, not rushed. So let me leave you here, in the silence of the hall of admission, with the warship in the window and the unarmed human on the speaker's floor and the trap collapsed, and every certainty in the galaxy hanging suspended. And let me tell you, in the final part, what Sarah Ape did with the most powerful warship in the galaxy, which was the most powerful thing I have ever seen anyone do, and which had nothing to do with the warship at all. Power that has to be used isn't power, Sarah Ape said, into the silence of the hall of admission. It's just violence with better paperwork. Real power is the thing you hold and don't use, because the whole point of having it was never to take. It was to make taking unnecessary. I have spent the rest of my life unpacking that sentence. Let me tell you what she did with it, because the words alone would be only words, and what made them true was what came after. She turned from HFY and the Cephal Dominion, and she addressed the whole hall of admission, every tier, every great power, in that same calm carrying voice, and she laid out what humanity actually wanted, which was not what anyone in that room had braced for. She did not demand Tessen. She did not demand a seat above the Dominion. She did not demand reparations or apologies or the punishment of the powers that had planned to profit from the well losing their home. She demanded one thing, and one thing only, and it was so much smaller and so much larger than anything the assembled Concord had imagined that it took the room a long moment to understand it. She demanded that Tessen be left alone, that the well keep their world, that the protection compact humanity had made be honored, not enforced by the warship, not imposed by threat, but recognized lawfully by the Concord as the binding promise it had always been. That was all. A small farming people would keep their fields. A young species promise to a smaller one would be allowed to mean what it said. That was the entirety of what the most powerful warship in the galaxy had come to demand. And when the room understood it, I felt the understanding move through the tears like a tide. And it was a strange and shaming thing, because every great power in that hall had braced to lose something to the humans, and instead the humans were asking for nothing except that someone else's home not be stolen. And then Sarah Ape did the thing that changed me, the thing that turned this from a victory into something I did not have a word for until later, when I had left protocol and become, in my small way, something better. She invited the Cephal Dominion to help. I am not exaggerating, and I am not simplifying. The human ambassador, holding the most powerful warship in the galaxy, with the Dominion's trap collapsed and HFY exposed and humiliated before the whole Concord, with every reason in the universe to crush the Dominion utterly. She turned back to HFY, and she offered the Dominion a way to stand in the light instead of the shadow. She said, "The thing under Tessen that you want, I've read the surveys too. It's real and it's valuable, and the well have never used it and never will because it means nothing to a farming people. So here's what I'm offering, not a seizure, a partnership. The well keep their world and their sovereignty and their fields. And the Dominion and anyone else who wants in negotiates with the well as equals fairly for the right to develop what's under their soil, with the well sharing in the wealth of their own world for the first time in their history. You get the resource. The well get rich and stay home. Nobody loses a world. Nobody gets administered off their land. You wanted to take it by making them small. I'm offering you a way to have most of what you wanted by treating them as people instead." She paused. "It's a better deal than the one you came here to make, HFY. It's just one you can't be ashamed of." The hall did not breathe. I did not breathe, because what Sarah Ape had just done was so far outside the logic of everything I had spent 40 years arranging that my mind struggled to hold it. She had taken total power, real, unanswerable, galaxy-altering power, and she had used it not to take, not even to punish, but to offer her defeated enemy a path to dignity. She had given HFY, the architect of a planned theft, the chance to become instead a fair partner, and she had done it not out of weakness, because the warship in the window made weakness impossible, but out of something the Cephal Dominion and the High Concord and I myself had no category for. The deliberate, powerful, sovereign choice to let an enemy keep their honor when you could have taken everything they had. I watched HFY receive it. The cold ancient face that had spoken of taking a world without raising a weapon, that had laughed at the small empty cradle. I watched it work through the offer, and I watched something happen in it that I do not think had happened in a very long time. HFY had expected, in the moment the warship appeared, to be destroyed, or humiliated, or stripped of everything, because that is what the Dominion would have done, in humanity's place, and the powerful always assume others share their nature. And instead the human had offered a deal that let the Dominion walk away with most of what it wanted, its dignity intact, recast from a thief into a partner. It was not mercy as weakness. It was mercy as overwhelming strength, mercy from a position where cruelty would have cost nothing. And that, I understood, watching HFY's face, was the one thing the Dominion's whole cold philosophy had no defense against, because it could not be understood as a move in the game of power. It was a move in some other game entirely, a game humanity was playing and the rest of us had never learned the rules of. HFY accepted. Of course HFY accepted. It was, as Aikped said, a better deal, and a Dominion envoy was nothing if not a calculator of advantage. But I saw in the acceptance more than calculation. I saw the beginning of something the Cephal Dominion had not felt in a very long time, the unease of a power that has just been shown a way of being strong that it does not know how to be. The humans had not beaten the Dominion. They had done something worse, something that would work on the Dominion slowly, for years. They had shown it in front of the whole galaxy that there was a kind of strength it did not possess, and could not buy, and could not conquer. The strength to hold absolute power and choose openly to share it. Every cold calculation the Dominion made from that day forward would have, somewhere in it, the memory of the day a human held the galaxy's mightiest weapon, and used it to make a fair deal for a farming people. That memory is a kind of slow poison to an empire built on taking. I have watched it work in the years since. The Dominion is not what it was. None of the great powers are. Because Sarah Ake taught the whole Concord in a single afternoon that the strongest thing in the galaxy had just declined to behave the way strength was supposed to behave. And once that has been seen, it cannot be unseen, and the old way of being strong begins, everywhere quietly, to look like what it always was: weakness, dressed up as power. The well-kept Tessen, they keep it still. The last I heard, the farming people of that small green world had grown wealthy on the fair development of what lay beneath their fields, and had used the wealth to do the thing farming peoples do, which is to make more green. They had begun terraforming the dead moons of their own system into gardens, a gentle people quietly turning their corner of the galaxy into something living. Humanity was admitted to the High Concord that day, not as a junior member but as a full one, because after the warship in the window there was no other admission the room could countenance. And then humanity did the last surprising thing, the thing that confirmed everything Sarah Ake had said. It sent the warship home, and it never brought it back. The most powerful vessel in the galaxy made one journey to one ceremony, and was never seen in Concord space again. Because the whole point of it, as Ake had told us, was never to be used. It existed to make a conversation possible between equals, and once that conversation had happened, it had served its entire purpose, and humanity put it away. The way you sheathe a blade you drew only to be sure no one would force you to swing it. I left protocol within the year. I could not go back to it, could not return to the careful, beautiful machinery of humiliation, the cold, dim petitioner's lights, the ceremonies of the lawfully crushed. I had spent 40 years as a craftsman of the thing Sarah Ape had exposed, the thing she had called violence with better paperwork, and once I had seen the alternative, once I had watched real power decline to take, I could not unsee what I had been. I went to Tessen in the end. I asked the well if a retired Liorn protocol officer might be useful to a people learning to negotiate as equals with the great powers of the galaxy, and they were kind, the way farming peoples are kind, and they took me in, and I spent the rest of my career using everything I knew about the machinery of power not to crush the weak, but to help a small people hold their ground in a hard galaxy. It is the only good work I have ever done. It is the work that has let me forgive, a little, the 40 years before it. I met Sarah Ape once more, years later when she passed through Tessen on some quiet errand, no warship anywhere near her, just an aging human ambassador traveling alone the way she had walked the grand approach alone. I told her who I was, the protocol officer who had assigned the small cradle, who had designed the petitioner's light, who had arranged the humiliation she had walked through as if it were not there. I expected her to be cold to me. She was not. She listened to my confession, all of it, and when I was done she was quiet a moment, and then she said the thing that I will end with, because it is the truest thing anyone ever said to me. She said, "You know what the ship was really for. Everyone thinks it was for the Dominion. It wasn't. The Dominion was always going to fold the second they saw they couldn't win cheap. Powerful cowards always do. The ship was for you, for the ones in the middle, the clerks and the protocol officers and the careful people who keep the machinery running and tell themselves they're just doing their jobs. We brought the most powerful warship in the galaxy and then didn't use it in front of all of you so that every one of you would have to watch power refuse to be cruel and would have to ask yourself for the rest of your life why you'd always assumed it couldn't." She smiled, tired and kind. "You left, didn't you? You came here. That's the whole reason we brought the ship, not to beat the Dominion. To reach the one careful person in the room who still had a conscience folded up somewhere, and show them it was allowed to open it." She put her hand on my shoulder, a human gesture I had come to understand. "That was always the most powerful thing in that hall, Ossun, not the warship. You. The ship was just loud enough to make you look. They expected a shuttle. Earth sent the most powerful warship in the galaxy. And then the human who flew it declined to fire a single shot, declined to take a single thing, declined to crush a single enemy, and instead made a fair deal for a farming people, sent the warship home forever, and reached, across all the cold machinery of galactic power, one tired old protocol officer who had forgotten he had a conscience, and reminded him it was allowed to open. The warship was never the point. The warship was only ever loud enough to make us look. And what we saw when we finally looked was the thing the galaxy had been too proud and too afraid to learn for 10,000 years, that the strongest power of all is the one that, holding everything, chooses to take nothing, and that this is not weakness, and never was, and that we had called it weakness only because we had never once been strong enough to try it. I am Liorn. I keep no protocols anymore. I keep, instead, the memory of the day power walked into a room built to humiliate the weak, and chose to be gentle, and changed everything. And I tell it to anyone who will listen, because somewhere in every cold room there is a careful person with a folded-up conscience, and all it takes is one loud, gentle thing to make them look.